In the quiet heart of Chicago, long after the chaos of Capone's era had faded into history books, an old man sat in a modest suburban home surrounded by silence. His name was Anthony Joseph Accardo, though in whispered tones he was known by many names, Big Tuna, Joe Batters, or simply, the Don who never went to prison. Outside, the world had moved on. The skyline glittered with new towers, jazz had given way to rock, and gangsters had become movie characters. But within that quiet house, in the calm rhythm of suburban life, lived a man who once ruled an empire of crime that stretched from Chicago's back alleys to Las Vegas's neon lights. There was something paradoxical about Tony Accardo's story. To the untrained eye, he appeared like any retired grandfather, reading the newspaper, tending to his garden, and smiling at neighborhood children. But behind that peaceful exterior lay decades of cunning, ruthlessness, and power so immense that his word could shift the tides of an entire city. Unlike the flashy dons who sought fame, Accardo believed in something more enduring, anonymity. He ruled through silence, through discipline, through the fear that his calm presence alone could inspire. It was this mastery of invisibility that allowed him to live and die untouched by prison bars. Chicago was no stranger to violence. By the time Accardo came of age, the city had already witnessed the blood-soaked reign of Al Capone, whose empire of bootlegging and brutality had defined the 1920s. But Capone's fall, and the chaos that followed, left a vacuum that only someone with extraordinary patience and intelligence could fill. That man was Tony Accardo. He didn't seize power with guns blazing or speeches roaring, he simply waited. Watched. Learned. And when the time was right, he became the mind that rebuilt the outfit into something far stronger, far quieter, and far more enduring than Capone's empire ever was. Imagine a man so disciplined that he could navigate decades of organized crime, prohibition, gambling syndicates, Las Vegas expansion, FBI crackdowns, without ever spending a single day in prison. That was Accardo's genius. He understood that violence was a tool, not a lifestyle. That attention was danger. And that power, to truly last, must never be seen too clearly. In a world of volatile tempers and restless egos, Accardo was ice. Calm, patient, and always several steps ahead. There's an old saying in Chicago's underworld, the loudest man in the room is the weakest. Tony Accardo lived by the opposite rule. His presence was like a whisper carried by the wind, unseen, but unmistakably there. He rarely appeared in photographs, spoke little to outsiders, and left almost no personal record. Yet every major decision within the outfit bore his unseen fingerprints. He was both everywhere and nowhere. A ghost with a cigar and a ledger. To understand Tony Accardo's story is to enter a world where silence was strategy and invisibility was armor. His life wasn't one of cinematic explosions or car chases, it was a chess game played in shadows. Each move calculated, each risk weighed. And while countless mobsters before and after him fell to bullets or indictments, Accardo endured. When law enforcement thought they had cornered him, he was already somewhere else, mentally, legally, tactically. It was as if he had mapped every possible outcome long before the first question was asked. But perhaps what makes his tale so haunting is not just how he lived, but how he died. Peacefully. In his sleep. No courtroom, no police raid, no betrayal from within. For a man surrounded by death his entire life, that ending almost feels like an illusion. Was it luck? Genius? Or a lifetime of discipline so precise that even fate bowed before him? As we drift deeper into this story tonight, we'll peel back the layers of Tony Accardo's life, the poor boy from Little Italy who became the silent ruler of Chicago, the right hand to Capone who outlasted every rival, and the rare mob boss whose greatest weapon was restraint. His journey isn't just about crime, it's about control, psychology, and the art of surviving in a world designed to destroy its kings. The streets may have forgotten his footsteps, but his legend remains, quietly echoing through the corridors of organized crime history. And so, as the night deepens and the city sleeps, let's step into the shadows of the Windy City, to follow the story of the man who ruled without ever being seen, and who proved that true power doesn't shout. It whispers. Chicago in the early 1900s was a city of contrasts, glittering with promise, yet weighed down by hardship. The streets of Little Italy were narrow and crowded, filled with the scent of fresh bread, the sound of children's laughter, and the constant rhythm of survival. Families had come from across the Atlantic, searching for the American dream, only to find poverty, factory work, and prejudice waiting for them. In these tight-knit neighborhoods, men worked long hours in sweatshops or on construction sites, while women stretched every dollar to feed large families. The nights were alive with noise, arguments, laughter, music, and sometimes, gunfire echoing in the distance. It was here, among the cobblestone streets and dim street lamps, that a boy named Tony Accardo learned the ways of the world. Born Anthony Joseph Accardo in 1906, the son of Sicilian immigrants, his childhood was marked not by comfort, but by grit. His father worked as a shoemaker, quiet and hard-working, while his mother kept the family together with strict discipline and strong faith. They spoke Italian at home, clung to old customs, and taught their children respect for family and tradition. But outside, Chicago was a battlefield of class and opportunity. The streets offered something his parents never could, a different kind of education. It was there that Tony first learned about power, loyalty, and fear. As a boy, he wasn't the biggest or the loudest, but he had sharp eyes and a calmness beyond his years. He watched older kids run errands for men in expensive suits, saw cars with tinted windows glide through alleys, and overheard whispers of names that carried both awe and terror. He began to understand that in this city, respect wasn't earned through school or honest labor, it was taken, often violently. He learned early that fear could be more powerful than money, and silence could be more valuable than speech. School didn't hold his attention. Like many boys from poor families, he dropped out around the age of 14. By then, the lure of the streets was too strong. Street gangs were everywhere, small groups of boys who started with petty theft and ended up in organized crime. The boundaries between childhood mischief and criminal enterprise were thin and easily crossed. Tony began running errands, shining shoes for a few coins, and later, acting as a lookout for neighborhood gamblers. It was innocent enough at first, or so it seemed. But every errand brought him one step closer to the underworld that would define his life. He was quiet, observant, and precise. Even at a young age, Tony had a gift for reading people, their motives, their weaknesses, their limits. Older gang members noticed this. They saw that while other boys talked too much or acted recklessly, Tony kept his mouth shut and did exactly what was asked. That reliability was gold in the criminal world. Before long, he was running small jobs, delivering packages, collecting payments, and learning the delicate balance between threat and charm. The lessons came fast, and they stuck. Chicago in those days was under transformation. The Prohibition era was just beginning, and alcohol, suddenly illegal, had become the most profitable business in America. Bars went underground, and gangsters rose above ground. Bootleggers, smugglers, and killers filled the void that law and order had left behind. The city became a living organism pulsing with illicit opportunity. For a young man like Accardo, it wasn't a matter of if he would be pulled into that world, but when. There was something about Tony that made him different from other street kids. He wasn't driven by impulse or greed, he was methodical. He didn't seek attention or glory. He understood that the smartest men in the room were often the quietest. He blended in, studied, and waited. When fights broke out, he stayed back, watching how authority shifted from one moment to the next. When the police raided a game room or arrested a bootlegger, he noted who escaped and who got caught. These silent observations became his playbook. By his late teens, Tony was already known in his neighborhood, not as a troublemaker, but as someone who got things done. He was polite, respectful, and discreet. Shopkeepers trusted him. Gangsters noticed him. That combination of innocence and calculation made him valuable. Rumors began to swirl that a man named Al Capone was looking for sharp young recruits to expand his growing empire. Capone's reach was spreading fast through Chicago, and his lieutenants were always watching for potential talent. Somewhere in the smoky haze of those early years, Tony Accardo's name crossed their path. But before he ever stood in Capone's shadow, Tony learned something more important than any street trick: the power of control. In a world of shouting men and flying bullets, he learned to move slowly, speak softly, and think ahead. He discovered that calmness could be its own weapon, one that disarmed enemies and inspired loyalty. This understanding, born in the cramped alleys of Little Italy, would one day make him one of the most feared and respected men in organized crime. At home, his parents likely sensed the drift, though they could do little to stop it. Like many immigrant families, they were caught between survival and hope, between old-world morality and new-world necessity. They wanted better for their son, but the streets had already claimed him. The world outside offered something intoxicating: money, respect, and belonging. For a boy from nothing, that was a promise too powerful to ignore. The city lights flickered across the river, reflecting the double life that Chicago always held: beauty and danger intertwined. As Tony grew older, he learned that the city's true language wasn't English or Italian, it was influence. And influence was earned in quiet deeds, not loud declarations. That would become his creed, even before he knew it. The lessons of those early years, the hardship, the hunger, the discipline, were shaping a man who would one day rule the city without ever raising his voice. He wasn't a legend yet. Just a boy with sharp eyes and steady hands, walking home through streets that would one day carry his name in whispers. The cold wind off Lake Michigan swept through the alleys, carrying with it the faint echoes of destiny. Tony Accardo, the shoemaker's son, was still just another face in the crowd. But deep inside, something had already awakened, a calm ambition, waiting for its moment. The 1920s were roaring across America, an age of jazz, speakeasies, and shadowed deals made under the soft glow of streetlights. In Chicago, the city pulsed with energy and danger. It was the capital of bootleg liquor, where the clinking of glasses in secret clubs was often followed by the echo of gunfire in the streets. Police were either bought or buried, and every man with ambition sought a piece of the forbidden gold flowing through the underworld. For Tony Accardo, now in his late teens, this was a world ready to be claimed, a world that rewarded silence, loyalty, and fearlessness. He had all three. Accardo's introduction to organized crime didn't come through an explosion of violence or some cinematic heist. It began, like many criminal careers, with small acts: driving a truck here, delivering a package there. His neighborhood contacts connected him with low-level bootleggers, men who smuggled whiskey across state lines and distributed it to secret bars called speakeasies. Tony was a natural at this work. He was punctual, discreet, and calm under pressure. In a world where mistakes could mean death, these traits were rare and valuable. By 1926, Chicago's bootlegging empire was under the iron rule of Al Capone, the most feared and famous gangster in America. Capone had built an operation so vast that it required an army to maintain it. Drivers, guards, accountants, gunmen, everyone had a role, and everyone knew their place. Tony Accardo, still a young man barely in his 20s, was drawn into this orbit through a combination of skill and circumstance. He joined one of Capone's crews, handling transportation and protection jobs. At first, he kept his head down, learning the rhythms of the business, studying how power moved between men. Capone was known for his charisma and volatility, but behind him stood lieutenants who kept the empire running smoothly, men like Frank Nitti and Tony's eventual mentor, Frank Rio. These were men of calculation, who valued efficiency over ego. They noticed the quiet young man who never complained, never panicked, and never talked more than necessary. Tony quickly earned a reputation for reliability. When something needed to be done without noise or hesitation, his name was whispered. It was during this time that Accardo earned the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, Joe Batters. The story, as it was later told, took place one night in a dimly lit restaurant. A few men had betrayed Capone, and as punishment, they were brought to a back room. Capone, always the showman, wanted to make an example of them. He ordered Accardo to carry out the beating, to teach the others what disloyalty cost. Without hesitation, Tony complied, using a baseball bat to end their lives swiftly and brutally. When the room fell silent, Capone, half impressed, half amused, looked at him and said, "This kid's a real Joe Batters." The name stuck. But behind the nickname was something deeper, a recognition of his cold precision. Accardo wasn't driven by rage or cruelty, he acted with purpose. That calm ruthlessness became his signature. In a world fueled by emotion, he was ice. Under Capone's guidance, Tony saw firsthand the empire's inner workings. Trucks loaded with Canadian whiskey, warehouses filled with contraband, the elaborate bribery networks that kept police and politicians quiet, it was an operation as sophisticated as any corporation. Tony learned the art of logistics, of managing men, and, most importantly, of knowing when not to speak. He began to understand that real power didn't come from fear alone, it came from control. And Capone's empire, for all its noise and blood, was beginning to lose control. The late 1920s were violent even by Chicago standards. Rival gangs fought for territory in what felt like a never-ending war. Bombings, drive-by shootings, and ambushes were common. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929 sent shockwaves through the city and marked the beginning of the end for Capone's reign. But through it all, Accardo survived. While others sought glory or revenge, he focused on survival. He stayed close to Capone but avoided unnecessary attention, often working behind the scenes, handling the tasks no one else wanted to touch. He learned to read the weather of power, to sense when to act and when to vanish. Capone's empire, though massive, was cracking under its own weight. Federal agents were closing in, public outrage was mounting, and the government was becoming more aggressive. Tony, ever the observer, began to take notes, not on paper, but in memory, about what mistakes led to downfall. He saw how fame was Capone's poison. The flashy suits, the photographers, the headlines, all of it painted a target too bright to ignore. Tony vowed he would never make the same mistake. The men who lasted longest in the mob weren't the loudest or most feared, they were the ones who learned to become invisible. Accardo began shaping himself into exactly that kind of man. He kept his personal life quiet, avoided excessive drinking, and treated violence as a tool rather than a habit. When others bragged about killings or money, he listened in silence. The fewer words spoken, the less that could be used against him. It was this mindset that would eventually make him untouchable. By the early 1930s, as Capone faced the full weight of federal prosecution for tax evasion, Accardo was already transitioning from street enforcer to strategist. He had survived the bloodiest years of Chicago's gang wars and emerged stronger, wiser, and unnoticed by the law. That anonymity became his greatest advantage. While Capone's name was splashed across newspapers, Accardo's remained in the shadows, an asset he would guard for life. Yet even in the darkness, whispers grew. Those who worked with him began to see a different kind of leader emerging, one who preferred calm conversation to threats, one who never raised his voice yet was obeyed without question. He had learned the essential lesson of organized crime: the goal wasn't to rule with fear, but with quiet inevitability. When Tony Accardo gave an order, it wasn't shouted, it was simply understood. He was still young, but already the seeds of something far greater had taken root. He had seen the empire rise and watched its cracks form. He had learned from Capone's arrogance and Nitty's cunning, understanding that the future of crime lay not in violence but in structure. For Accardo, crime was never chaos, it was business. And business, when done properly, left no fingerprints. As the 1930s dawned, Chicago's streets were changing. The jazz still played, but the laughter was thinner now, haunted by the ghosts of the Prohibition Wars. Capone sat behind bars, and the empire he built was shifting hands. Somewhere in those quiet transitions, Tony Accardo stepped from being a soldier to something more, a man who could see the long game, who could rule not with blood, but with patience. The boy from Little Italy had become a mobster, but not just any mobster. He was becoming the architect of a dynasty that would outlast them all. And as the city slept, lulled by the hum of distant trains and the soft whisper of winter wind, a legend was taking shape, calm, disciplined, and destined for immortality. The making of a mobster was complete. The fall of Al Capone marked not only the end of an era but the beginning of a transformation that would reshape the Chicago outfit forever. The city, once loud with the sounds of machine guns and bootleg trucks roaring through alleys, was suddenly quieter, uncertain. In the wake of chaos came opportunity, and among the survivors who understood this best was a man who had spent years learning silently in the shadows, Tony Accardo. When Capone was imprisoned for tax evasion in 1931, his empire didn't crumble overnight, but it began to lose direction. The men who had thrived on his charisma and violent rule suddenly found themselves adrift. Without Capone's leadership, there was confusion, paranoia, and a rush for control. Many of Capone's top lieutenants either went into hiding, fled the country, or were taken down by law enforcement. But Tony Accardo, still young, still mostly unknown, kept his composure. He had seen this moment coming. He had learned the most valuable lesson from Capone's downfall: visibility is vulnerability. While Capone had sought fame, Tony sought invisibility. He watched as newspapers turned gangsters into celebrities and then into prisoners. The public spotlight that once seemed like power was, in truth, a spotlight for the executioner. Accardo vowed to never repeat that mistake. He wouldn't be a public figure, he would be the quiet architect behind the scenes. As Capone's empire faltered, new names rose to power: Frank Nitti, Jake Guzik, Paul Ricca, men who understood that the future of organized crime wasn't in the streets, but in the system. They began turning the outfit from a gang into a business. Illegal liquor had made them rich, but it had also made them visible. The next generation sought quieter profits: gambling, unions, construction, and legitimate fronts. Accardo, with his calm intelligence and disciplined nature, became an essential part of that evolution. Frank Nitti, Capone's trusted enforcer turned boss, saw something in Tony that reminded him of himself but with a sharper edge. He wasn't reckless. He didn't draw attention. He didn't need to. Nitti began giving him more responsibility, moving him away from muscle work and into operations that required planning and discretion. Tony learned how to manage crews, how to balance risk, and how to handle money. For the first time, he wasn't just enforcing the outfit's rules, he was helping shape them. The 1930s were a strange decade for organized crime. Prohibition was ending, drying up the river of easy money that had built empires. The outfit had to adapt fast, or it would collapse like the old bootlegging gangs. Accardo became one of the key minds in this transformation. He saw opportunity in the city's gambling houses, horse tracks, and underground casinos. He helped establish systems to keep profits steady and law enforcement out of the loop. His reputation within the outfit grew, not because of fear, but because of respect. He was the man who never made mistakes. While other mobsters were arrested, robbed, or killed, Accardo moved with quiet precision. He made few enemies and kept fewer friends. He believed loyalty was currency, and he never spent it carelessly. When the outfit began tightening its control over labor unions and construction companies, he was there, quietly ensuring that every piece moved as planned. He wasn't in the newspapers or the police reports, but his influence was spreading like smoke. During these years, Accardo developed his defining philosophy: power was best used when it was invisible. He began to operate almost like a businessman, sitting in meetings rather than gunfights, negotiating rather than threatening. He rarely lost his temper, and when he did, it was brief and terrifying, a storm that ended as quickly as it began. Men who worked for him knew that silence meant approval, and a raised eyebrow could mean the end of a life. He didn't need to shout. His calm presence was enough. By the mid-1930s, the outfit was no longer a chaotic gang, it was an institution. And though he wasn't at the top yet, Accardo had become one of its most reliable and influential figures. He had earned a reputation as a man who could clean up any mess without leaving fingerprints. He was now trusted to oversee operations that stretched far beyond Chicago, places like Kansas City, Milwaukee, and even the early gambling setups in Nevada. Wherever money moved quietly, Tony Accardo's hand was near it. Meanwhile, the FBI and local law enforcement continued their war on organized crime. Raids were common, arrests frequent. But Tony remained untouched. He had mastered the art of distance, always delegating, never handling cash or contraband directly, and never leaving a paper trail. When questioned, he was polite, cooperative, and forgetful. It was a performance so natural that even hardened detectives left the room doubting their own suspicions. As the decade drew to a close, the Chicago outfit stood stronger than ever, but it was different now. Gone were the days of open gun battles in the streets. The organization had matured into something colder, smarter, and far more efficient. It was no longer about fame or infamy, it was about longevity. And at the quiet heart of it all was Tony Accardo, the man who had watched the Capone empire burn and decided that survival was the only true measure of power. He began to build a personal code, one that guided every move he made from that point on: never lie unnecessarily. Never act out of anger. Never draw attention. And never, ever trust the spotlight. That code would become the foundation of his entire reign. Others in the mob thought success was about taking more, Tony understood it was about lasting longer. As he looked around the city that had once been Capone's playground, he could see the ghosts of the old guard fading away. The flashy gangsters, the loud bosses, the ones who craved recognition, all gone. In their place stood men like him, strategists, not soldiers. The kind who knew that the future of crime was not chaos, but control. By the dawn of the 1940s, the transformation was nearly complete. Accardo, once a street enforcer swinging a bat, had become one of the most respected minds in organized crime. He had outlived the legends, outsmarted the system, and emerged from the ashes of Capone's empire as something far greater. He wasn't the loudest man in the room. He was the one quietly writing the next chapter of Chicago's underworld. And as history would soon prove, that silence was more powerful than any gun. The 1940s ushered in a new era for the Chicago outfit, and at its center stood a man who had mastered the art of quiet dominance. Tony Accardo was no longer just a trusted enforcer or middleman, he was becoming something much more refined, a strategist, a thinker, and, in many ways, the soul of a criminal enterprise learning to evolve. The Chicago underworld had survived its bloodiest years, and now it was shifting towards something colder, smarter, and more sustainable. The days of Tommy guns and street brawls were giving way to boardroom meetings and complex financial schemes. It was in this transformation that Tony Accardo found his true calling. By the early 1940s, Accardo had learned nearly every aspect of the outfit's business. He knew how the numbers rackets operated, how money flowed through casinos, and how bribes bought silence from police officers and judges. He had studied the anatomy of organized crime from the inside, dissecting its strengths and weaknesses. What separated him from others was his foresight. He wasn't content with short-term success, he wanted to build a structure that would last decades. To do that, he needed to replace chaos with order. Frank Nitti was still nominally the boss, but his health and nerves were deteriorating. The constant pressure from law enforcement had left him paranoid and unstable. When Nitti died by suicide in 1943, leadership passed to Paul Ricca, known as the Waiter, a man of intellect and restraint. Ricca recognized Accardo's value immediately. While others in the outfit competed for visibility or wealth, Accardo remained disciplined, focused, and loyal. Ricca made him his protégé, teaching him how to think like a leader, not a soldier. Accardo's influence began to stretch quietly across Chicago. He organized meetings, settled disputes, and handled sensitive negotiations. Those who underestimated him soon realized that beneath his calm demeanor lay a mind that missed nothing. He was calculating, patient, and unflinchingly practical. When violence was necessary, he used it sparingly, but decisively. There was no showmanship, no anger, no chaos. He treated every act, even murder, as a business decision. The outfit under Ricca and Accardo began moving away from reckless displays of power and toward a system built on efficiency and respect. Gambling became the central operation, lucrative, steady, and less visible than bootlegging. The outfit infiltrated racetracks, casinos, and backroom betting parlors, taking a cut from every transaction. Unions were the next frontier. By controlling labor organizations, they could influence construction, transportation, and even film distribution. It was organized crime reinvented, quiet, structured, and deeply rooted in the city's economy. Accardo became known for his meticulous approach. He insisted on knowing the details of every operation, from who collected money to where it was hidden. He demanded precision and punished carelessness. But unlike other bosses, he didn't rule through fear alone. Those who served him well were rewarded generously. He understood the power of loyalty built through fairness. That balance, between kindness and absolute authority, made him unique. Men who worked for him described him as unreadable. His face rarely showed emotion, his voice rarely rose. When he spoke, he chose his words with surgical care. Even in private, he was composed, as though every conversation might be overheard. In a world full of impulsive gangsters, Accardo was methodical, a man who played the long game. He didn't just want control over the streets, he wanted influence over the systems that governed them. During World War II, Chicago was booming with industry. Factories ran day and night, the docks were filled with shipments, and workers flooded the city. The outfit saw opportunity everywhere. Accardo helped expand their reach into labor racketeering, ensuring that unions, shipping routes, and warehouses all paid silent tribute to the outfit's power. Yet, even as profits soared, he kept a low profile. While others flaunted their wealth in nightclubs, Accardo preferred dinner at home with his wife Clarice and their children. The duality of his life, family man by day, silent king by night, became his shield. By the mid-1940s, he was effectively the second most powerful man in the outfit, even if his name was rarely spoken outside the organization. He operated from behind closed doors, making decisions that shaped the lives of hundreds of men. When disputes arose between rival factions or crews, Accardo was the one who mediated. He never shouted, never lost control. Instead, he would sit quietly, listen to every side, and then give a simple, measured answer. His judgment was final, and almost always right. His calm nature didn't mean he was without edge. Beneath that composure lay a ruthless instinct. If someone betrayed the outfit, Accardo didn't rage or threaten. He simply ensured they disappeared, often without a trace. To him, vengeance wasn't personal, it was administrative. This combination of intelligence and ruthlessness made him both respected and feared. The men around him learned that disobedience didn't bring loud punishment, it brought quiet, permanent consequences. One of Accardo's greatest strengths was delegation. He believed in creating layers of insulation, trusted men who would handle business while keeping him out of direct contact with crime. This system made him nearly impossible to convict. Every operation had distance between Accardo and the evidence. When questioned by the police, he appeared as an ordinary businessman with clean hands. This structure would later become the model for organized crime across America, influencing families in New York, Kansas City, and Los Angeles. The transition from soldier to strategist was complete by the late 1940s. Accardo's intelligence and caution had elevated him from the ranks of enforcers to the inner circle of leadership. He began thinking less like a gangster and more like a CEO. The outfit's finances were diversified, its influence spread across multiple states, and its reputation restored after the chaos of Capone's era. But most importantly, it had something it had never truly possessed before: stability. Accardo's role in this transformation cannot be overstated. He was the mind that turned brutality into bureaucracy. He turned chaos into system, blood into business, and fear into quiet respect. He was not a man who chased wealth for its own sake, he chased control. And control, once achieved, had to be maintained through patience, calculation, and absolute composure. In those years, while America celebrated victory in the war and entered an age of prosperity, Tony Accardo sat at the heart of a different kind of empire, one built on silence and shadows. He wasn't the face of the Chicago outfit, but he was its architect, its conscience, and its hidden hand. His influence stretched far beyond Chicago, touching every major racket in the Midwest, yet his name appeared in no headlines. To outsiders, he was invisible. To insiders, he was indispensable. And as the decade turned and new challenges loomed, Tony Accardo stood ready, not with guns or boasts, but with the same steady calm that had carried him from the streets of Little Italy to the pinnacle of organized crime. He had become more than a mobster, he had become a master of survival. The quiet rise was nearly complete, and the man who once swung a bat for Capone was now preparing to run an empire with nothing but his mind. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, Chicago had changed, but beneath the glimmer of post-war prosperity, the outfit had become a shadow government of its own, silent, efficient, and deeply entrenched in the city's bloodstream. And standing at its quiet center was Tony Accardo, no longer the apprentice, no longer the student. He was now the guiding force behind Chicago's criminal empire, a man who would shape its identity for generations to come. The transition was complete. The Chicago outfit had evolved from the loud, violent chaos of Capone's rule into a sleek, disciplined organization. It was no longer a gang, it was a system. Accardo understood something few gangsters ever did, that survival in the modern world depended on invisibility. The age of public shootouts and newspaper headlines was over. Now, power would thrive in the spaces where attention faded, in unions, construction bids, gambling networks, and political favors whispered over cigars. He envisioned the outfit as a business with layers of legitimacy wrapped around its criminal core. To achieve this, he replaced the old gangster mentality with something far more dangerous, corporate thinking. Under his guidance, the outfit began to function like an enterprise. Every territory, racket, and partnership was treated as a department. Reports were made, profits were tracked, and risks were calculated. Violence became rare, not because the outfit had grown soft, but because efficiency had replaced chaos. Accardo didn't need wars to prove dominance, he had already won through structure. The men beneath him knew that their survival depended on order, and Tony ensured that order with precision and restraint. The public, meanwhile, saw a different Chicago, a city growing upward, filled with promise. Skyscrapers climbed higher, highways spread outward, and factories churned out the products of post-war America. Yet, quietly, the outfit's money flowed beneath it all. Construction companies, trucking firms, labor unions, all carried invisible ties to Accardo's empire. He was patient in his expansion, moving slowly, choosing where to invest his influence with surgical precision. To outsiders, it appeared as if crime in Chicago had finally gone quiet. In truth, it had gone professional. The outfit's reach extended far beyond state lines. Illegal gambling was one of its strongest arms. Accardo oversaw the development of betting networks that stretched through the Midwest, connected by phone lines, couriers, and coded messages. He established operations in small towns and suburbs where law enforcement was less attentive. The profits were steady and immense, funding legitimate businesses that served as fronts. When law enforcement cracked down on one operation, 3 more appeared in its place. And yet, through all this growth, Accardo maintained his discipline. He didn't live flamboyantly. While many mobsters flaunted their wealth in tailored suits and nightclubs, Accardo remained understated. He drove modest cars, lived in a comfortable but unpretentious home, and dressed neatly but without flash. His power was never on display, it was understood. Those who worked under him said that when Tony Accardo entered a room, the atmosphere changed. Not because he demanded respect, but because his silence carried it. It was during this time that Accardo's leadership style became legend. He preferred conversation to conflict, solutions to problems. He rarely raised his voice, yet no one ever interrupted him. His meetings were calm and deliberate, more like business conferences than underworld councils. When someone failed or betrayed him, the punishment was quiet, swift, and absolute. To him, emotion had no place in decision-making. Every move was calculated to serve the outfit's longevity. He would often say, quietly, firmly, that, the less they know about you, the longer you last. The transition from blood to business required intelligence, but it also required fear. Accardo's genius was in balancing both. He let his underbosses and captains handle the visible side of the outfit, the negotiations, the gambling houses, the clubs, while he remained in the background. To many, he was a ghost. Yet everyone knew that every major decision passed through his silent approval. He didn't have to remind them who was in charge, his absence was enough to command obedience. Accardo also understood the importance of political relationships. Chicago had long been a city where corruption ran as deep as its train tunnels, and Tony knew how to make it work for him. Through donations, deals, and quiet favors, the outfit ensured that politicians looked the other way. City officials, police captains, even judges owed debts of gratitude that were never spoken but always remembered. Accardo rarely met with these men personally, he had intermediaries handle the details, but everyone knew who truly pulled the strings. As the outfit grew more sophisticated, so did its interests. Las Vegas was becoming the new frontier, and while New York families rushed to stake their claim in the desert, Accardo approached it differently. He preferred indirect ownership through silent partnerships. Chicago money helped build casinos and resorts, but his name was never attached. He made sure that legitimate investors stood in front while the outfit collected profits quietly in the background. It was the perfect business, visible success masking invisible control. By the early 1950s, the Chicago outfit was more powerful than it had ever been. Its tentacles reached into every level of city life. The police force, labor unions, nightclubs, and even the courts, all were influenced, directly or indirectly, by Accardo's men. Yet, remarkably, the violence that had once defined Chicago's underworld had nearly vanished. Murders were rare, and when they happened, they were surgical, not chaotic. The press called it a peaceful era, but insiders knew it was the calm enforced by Accardo's discipline. He had transformed the very definition of organized crime. No longer was it about control through intimidation alone, it was control through systems, influence, and fear of disruption. The outfit had become like a shadow government, operating parallel to legitimate institutions. And in the middle of it all, Tony Accardo ruled without shouting, without boasting, and without ever needing to show his hand. His men often said that working for Accardo felt like working for an invisible father. He didn't seek to be loved or even liked, he sought respect, and he earned it. The loyalty he commanded was deep because it was based on consistency. He didn't make empty promises. If he gave his word, he kept it. If he made a threat, it was carried out, once and permanently. That predictability made him terrifying. You could reason with him, but you could never deceive him. By the mid-1950s, the transformation was complete. The outfit was no longer a gang of outlaws, it was an empire of businessmen who operated in the dark. Accardo had succeeded where Capone failed, he had built something sustainable, something immune to the spotlight. While other mob bosses across the country were making headlines, Tony Accardo was making history quietly, one calculated move at a time. And so, Chicago stood divided, its public face clean and ambitious, its hidden heart pulsing with organized precision. In boardrooms and backrooms alike, decisions were made that shaped the city's destiny. And behind it all was the same calm man who never raised his voice, never saw the inside of a cell, and never lost control. The outfit had evolved, and so had its king. Tony Accardo had become the embodiment of the new order, a man whose greatest power was not in his fists or his wealth, but in his restraint. The city might have believed it was free from the ghosts of Capone's era, but in truth, Chicago still belonged to the shadows. And in those shadows, Tony Accardo stood perfectly still, watching, listening, and ruling without ever being seen. The 1950s brought America into a golden age of prosperity, suburban homes, shiny new cars, and a booming economy. On the surface, Chicago looked cleaner, calmer, and more stable than it had in decades. But beneath that calm exterior, a silent empire thrived, and its unseen ruler was Tony Accardo. He had risen from the ranks of street enforcers to become one of the most powerful figures in organized crime, not through bloodshed or theatrics, but through quiet intelligence and ruthless control. He was now the architect of a criminal system so organized that it mirrored legitimate corporations. And as the outfit grew into a national powerhouse, Accardo became its silent CEO. The foundation of his empire lay in what he called the business of vice. Gambling, extortion, and labor racketeering were the outfit's bread and butter. But under Accardo, these enterprises were no longer reckless operations run by street thugs, they were highly structured, efficient, and deeply intertwined with legitimate industries. He had turned organized crime into an economy of its own, one that ran parallel to the country's post-war boom. Every dice roll in a backroom casino, every card flipped in a smoky bar, every union vote quietly swayed by influence, all of it added to the outfit's fortune. Accardo had an uncanny ability to see opportunity where others saw risk. When Las Vegas began to rise from the desert sands, many in the underworld dismissed it as a gambler's fantasy. Accardo saw something different, a legal cover for illegal profits. While the New York families competed for ownership of flashy casinos, he preferred a quieter route. He used fronts, legitimate investors, companies, and distant associates, to funnel outfit money into Las Vegas developments. The profits were enormous, and the risk minimal. Accardo's fingerprints were nowhere to be found, but his influence was everywhere. Back home in Chicago, he refined the outfit's operations with a precision that bordered on obsession. He demanded that every dollar be accounted for, every racket carefully managed. He didn't tolerate waste, and he despised carelessness. Men who worked under him said that he had the patience of a banker and the instincts of a predator. He treated crime not as chaos but as craft, a science of survival and profit. His motto was simple: keep your head down, keep your book straight, and keep your mouth shut. To ensure smooth operations, Accardo built a hierarchy that resembled a corporation more than a criminal gang. At the top were the board members, trusted men like Paul Ricca, Murray Humphreys, and Jake Guzik, each responsible for a specific domain. Beneath them were lieutenants and supervisors who managed crews across the city. At the bottom were soldiers, runners, and collectors, the men on the streets who kept the gears turning. Everyone had a role, and everyone knew their place. It was an empire designed for longevity, not glory. Yet, for all his discipline, Accardo was no mere bureaucrat. He understood human nature better than most psychologists. He knew that greed and fear could drive men to extremes, so he managed both carefully. If someone did their job well, they were rewarded generously, bonuses, gifts, protection. But betrayal or disobedience was dealt with swiftly and silently. Accardo didn't make threats. He didn't need to. When someone crossed him, they simply vanished. Word spread quickly, and few needed reminders of what that meant. One of the defining moments of Accardo's leadership came during the outfit's expansion into legitimate business. With post-war construction booming, he saw that the true money wasn't in the streets, it was in the contracts. The outfit began infiltrating the building trades and construction unions, controlling which companies won bids for city projects. Concrete, steel, trucking, each industry quietly paid tribute. The profits were astronomical, but what mattered more was the control. Accardo had embedded the outfit so deeply in Chicago's infrastructure that removing it was almost impossible. He also took care to invest in the future. He placed trusted men in positions of influence, not only in Chicago but across the Midwest. Kansas City, Milwaukee, Cleveland, all became extensions of the outfit's reach. Unlike the fractious New York families that constantly fought each other, the outfit operated as one cohesive unit. Accardo ruled it not through fear alone, but through consistency and competence. His men followed him not because they were afraid to die, but because they knew they'd thrive under his rule. Despite his growing power, Tony lived modestly. His home in River Forest was large but not ostentatious, his cars clean but ordinary. To his neighbors, he seemed like any successful businessman, a family man who played golf, attended church, and doted on his children. Yet, those who knew his true identity understood that the calm suburban exterior concealed a man who had outlived legends. Capone had been famous. Giancana would one day be flamboyant. But Accardo would be eternal, precisely because he never stepped into the light. Still, law enforcement had not forgotten him. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover's growing obsession with organized crime, kept a close watch on Chicago. Agents tapped phones, tailed cars, and tried to infiltrate the outfit's ranks. But every investigation hit the same wall: no direct evidence, no witnesses brave enough to testify, and no paperwork linking Accardo to criminal operations. He was always one step removed, insulated by layers of loyal men who would rather die than speak his name. The newspapers called him "the man nobody knows." The title fit perfectly. What made Accardo extraordinary was his ability to evolve. As the old bootleggers and gangsters aged or died off, he adapted to a new America, an America of corporations, suburbs, and quiet money. He understood that brute force was outdated. The modern gangster didn't need a gun, he needed a ledger and a lawyer. Under his direction, the outfit became a hybrid, half underworld, half legitimate enterprise. The line between crime and commerce blurred until even the insiders couldn't always tell where one ended and the other began. By the mid-1950s, Tony Accardo had achieved something almost unimaginable. He controlled one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country. Influenced the city's economy, and yet remained a ghost in the public eye. He had no criminal record of significance, no public scandals, no indictments that stuck. In a world where every gangster eventually fell, either to bullets or prison, Accardo remained untouchable. The transformation was complete. The Chicago outfit had evolved from Capone's bloody empire into a business dynasty, and Tony Accardo was its silent monarch. He had proven that the greatest power was not loud, not flamboyant, and not feared by all, but unseen, inevitable, and permanent. And as the city slept, unaware of the empire that moved beneath its feet, Accardo sat in his River Forest home, reading the evening paper, sipping a quiet drink. To the world, he was just another successful man in post-war America. But to those who understood the shadows, he was something much more, a man who had conquered the underworld not through violence, but through vision. Tony Accardo's rise to absolute control wasn't defined by gunfights or grand proclamations, it was defined by discipline. While others ruled through terror, Accardo ruled through precision. He understood that true leadership in the criminal world wasn't about making noise, it was about making order. In the Chicago outfit, where loyalty could shift like the wind, Accardo established a new kind of authority, quiet, deliberate, and absolute. By the time the 1950s matured into the 1960s, his reign was secure, not because he demanded obedience, but because he made obedience logical. Everyone who worked under him understood that following his rules meant prosperity and survival. Breaking them meant disappearance. Unlike his predecessors, Accardo never sought public adoration or fear-driven fame. He didn't need to parade around in tailored suits or expensive jewelry. In fact, he detested that kind of attention. His enemies feared his silence far more than they ever feared Capone's rage. When Capone's men entered a room, they filled it with noise. When Accardo entered, silence followed naturally. There was something unsettling about his calmness, a controlled stillness that made others lower their voices without being told. He was the embodiment of restraint, and that restraint made him immortal in a world built on chaos. Accardo's leadership philosophy was simple but profound: stay low, stay smart, and stay loyal. He viewed leadership not as a position of privilege but as a responsibility for preservation, the preservation of the outfit's power, its men, and its reputation. He didn't tolerate recklessness. Every move, every meeting, every business deal was calculated. He demanded that operations run like clockwork. From gambling dens in Cicero to casinos in Las Vegas, nothing was left to chance. Every man knew his place, every dollar was traced, and every risk was measured. He also had a remarkable ability to see patterns others missed. When one racket began drawing too much attention, he'd pull back and redirect funds into another. When a law enforcement unit started cracking down on certain fronts, he'd quietly shut them down and reopen elsewhere. His adaptability was his weapon. It's said that Accardo never stayed attached to a single operation, he stayed attached to results. To him, nothing was sacred but survival. He rewarded competence generously. Men who delivered results received bonuses, business opportunities, and personal security. He treated his top lieutenants like partners rather than subordinates, encouraging them to think strategically rather than impulsively. It was this management style that made the outfit so efficient during his rule. The men under him felt valued, and more importantly, they felt protected. They knew that as long as they were loyal and quiet, Accardo would ensure they lived comfortably and safely. In an organization built on fear, that kind of stability was rare, and it bound men to him more tightly than threats ever could. But this didn't mean Accardo was soft. When it came to betrayal or incompetence, he was merciless. His punishments were never public, never messy, and never left questions. A man could vanish, and no one would ask where he went. That silence, that deliberate lack of spectacle, was what made him so terrifying. Violence, in Accardo's hands, became a form of punctuation, rare, but definitive. He believed that fear should never be noisy. The louder it was, the shorter it lasted. Inside the outfit, Accardo cultivated an atmosphere that mirrored his own personality: orderly, emotionless, and efficient. Meetings were formal and calm. There was no shouting, no theatrics, no table banging like in the stories of New York's mob families. Instead, discussions were handled like board meetings. Figures were reviewed, disputes settled, decisions finalized. Accardo didn't need to raise his voice, his eyes said enough. His calm command reminded every man that beneath his quiet demeanor lay a history of brutality known by those who tested him and never returned. Accardo's home life was the perfect reflection of his philosophy. He lived in River Forest, a clean, well-manicured suburb just outside Chicago. His house was large but tasteful, built of brick, with a neat lawn and an air of respectability. Neighbors saw a polite, reserved man who attended church on Sundays, doted on his children, and entertained guests modestly. To them, he was a successful businessman with old-fashioned manners. Few suspected that the serene man mowing his lawn had orchestrated one of the most powerful criminal networks in American history. That duality, ordinary on the surface, extraordinary beneath, was the essence of Tony Accardo. His invisibility was not luck, it was design. He knew that the less people saw of him, the more invincible he became. While his contemporaries in New York, men like Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, and later John Gotti, made headlines, Accardo stayed off the radar. The FBI knew his name, but not his life. Surveillance produced little more than pictures of him golfing, eating dinner with his family, or quietly entering restaurants. They suspected everything but could prove nothing. It was as though he had built an armor made of silence. Accardo's influence extended well beyond Chicago. Through alliances and quiet partnerships, he maintained strong connections with New York's 5 families, as well as the Cleveland and Kansas City mobs. But unlike other bosses who treated alliances as power contests, Accardo approached them like business deals. He preferred win-win arrangements, where profits were shared and bloodshed avoided. His logic was simple: violence was expensive, cooperation was profitable. As a result, Chicago's outfit remained stable and united while other cities fell into bloody power struggles. Even within his own ranks, Accardo was the ultimate arbiter. When disputes arose between capos, he listened, analyzed, and decided without bias. His verdicts were final, his reasoning clear. He never favored one side out of emotion or friendship. That sense of impartiality earned him immense respect. Men feared him, yes, but they also trusted him to be fair. In the underworld, that was a rare and powerful form of authority. Accardo's mastery lay not just in running the outfit but in making it invisible to the public. He eliminated unnecessary attention by forbidding his men from engaging in high-profile violence or attracting press coverage. Bars and clubs under his control were expected to operate cleanly. Police officers who were on the payroll were treated respectfully. He understood that corruption worked best when it was subtle. His empire didn't need intimidation on the streets, it thrived on influence in offices. He had become the unseen governor of Chicago's underworld, a man whose word could change destinies but who never appeared in the news. The outfit, under his leadership, wasn't a gang anymore. It was a machine, smooth and quiet, built to last decades. His success wasn't measured in fear or fame, but in stability. While other mob empires rose and fell, Accardo's continued. Untouched and undisturbed. In the grand tapestry of organized crime, Tony Accardo was the thread that held the Chicago outfit together through wars, investigations, and internal strife. He had turned a violent street empire into a criminal corporation, disciplined, lucrative, and nearly invisible. His leadership was so effective that, even decades later, the structure he built would continue to function under successors who followed his blueprint. And so, the man once known as Joe Batters, for his brutal beginnings had become something very different, a statesman of crime, a strategist who ruled without spectacle, and a figure who understood that power, to endure, must be silent. While others sought fame, Accardo sought forever. And in that quiet pursuit, he achieved it. By the mid-1950s, the transformation of Tony Accardo from a feared enforcer into an untouchable kingmaker was complete. The man who once patrolled Chicago's alleys now lived in one of its most peaceful suburbs, River Forest, Illinois. A quiet neighborhood lined with trees, manicured lawns, and wide streets where children rode bicycles and families gathered on porches in the summer twilight. To the untrained eye, Tony Accardo fit right in. He was polite to neighbors, tipped waiters well, and attended church with his wife, Clarice. He was the picture of calm domesticity. But beneath that facade of suburban respectability lay the calculating mind of a man who controlled an empire of crime that stretched across the nation. Accardo's home was a fortress disguised as a sanctuary. Built in the 1940s, the River Forest mansion was elegant but understated, brick exterior, tall windows, an immaculate lawn, and a driveway that curved just enough to obscure who was arriving or leaving. Inside, the decor reflected both refinement and practicality, marble floors, dark wood furniture, and soft lighting. His study was the heart of the home, a room lined with leather-bound books, a few framed photographs, and a single desk where business was quietly conducted. There were no phones tapped directly to illegal operations, no incriminating papers. Everything about the space was designed for discretion. To his neighbors, Tony was just Mr. Accardo, a quiet man with good manners. He golfed frequently, hosted modest dinners, and was known for his punctuality. The image was carefully curated, a shield against suspicion. Yet behind the calm evenings and the smell of freshly cut grass, the real business of his life unfolded in coded conversations, middlemen, and a network of trusted lieutenants who handled the outfit's day-to-day affairs. Accardo rarely left fingerprints on anything. He didn't sign contracts, didn't carry large sums of cash, and never personally handled illicit goods. He communicated through layers of intermediaries, ensuring that even his closest associates didn't know everything. His philosophy was simple: the less anyone could connect to him, the less there was to fear. That detachment made him nearly impossible to indict. Law enforcement knew he was in charge, they just couldn't prove it. The suburban lifestyle wasn't just camouflage, it was strategy. Accardo understood the psychology of invisibility. By removing himself from the noise of the city, he made himself seem harmless, respectable, even boring. He traded nightclubs for family dinners, public meetings for private phone calls, and headlines for silence. The contrast between his serene home life and the ruthless machinery he controlled created a mystique that baffled both police and journalists. They couldn't reconcile the gentle suburban father with the man who ruled Chicago's underworld. He played the role perfectly. On Sundays, he attended Mass with Clarice and their children. On weekdays, he played golf at private clubs, often with local businessmen or politicians who found his company unremarkably pleasant. He dressed conservatively, spoke softly, and never bragged. Even in casual conversation, he was measured, as though every word had been weighed in his mind before being released. When asked what business he was in, he'd smile faintly and say, investments. No one pressed further. Behind this calm mask, however, Accardo maintained total control of the outfit's sprawling empire. Gambling operations stretched from Chicago's west side to Nevada's casinos. Bookmaking and loan sharking continued to pour in steady revenue. Labor unions were under quiet control, ensuring that construction, trucking, and manufacturing businesses operated smoothly, and profitably, for the outfit. Accardo didn't just oversee these operations, he designed their structure to ensure his name never surfaced. He built walls of secrecy so layered that even if one piece fell, the rest remained untouched. Those who worked directly for him described his leadership as paradoxical, gentle but absolute. He could share a drink with a subordinate one night and, without hesitation, order that same man's death the next day if betrayal was discovered. His sense of loyalty was sacred, his sense of justice, cold. When asked years later how he managed to avoid prison while ruling an empire that thrived on crime, one of his former lieutenants said simply, "Tony never talked too much, and he never forgave twice." Despite his quiet existence, the FBI kept a close eye on him. Agents drove by his River Forest home, trailed his car to restaurants, and monitored his known associates. But they found nothing of value. Tony Accardo was too careful. He conducted no incriminating meetings in public, carried no written records, and spoke only through trusted emissaries. On the rare occasion he was summoned to testify or questioned, he remained calm, respectful, and forgetful. He could recall the names of his neighbors' children but never the men who delivered his gambling profits. His memory, it seemed, was conveniently selective. The 1950s and early 1960s were years of stability for the outfit. Under Accardo's guidance, it operated smoothly and quietly. Violence was minimal, profits steady. Chicago's criminal empire had become the most organized, least visible syndicate in America. While other cities experienced bloody wars between rival families, the outfit enjoyed a peace born of discipline. Accardo's leadership had transformed crime from spectacle to system. His domestic life further reinforced his myth. Family was everything to him, at least on the surface. He adored his children and often said they would never want for anything. His wife, Clarice, was elegant, reserved, and fiercely loyal. Together, they projected the image of the ideal American family. The irony wasn't lost on those who knew the truth, that the money funding their comfortable life came from a kingdom built on gambling, extortion, and corruption. But to Accardo, that duality was part of the game. Respectability was the best camouflage crime could buy. Occasionally, he'd host quiet gatherings at his home. Trusted associates would visit under the guise of social calls, barbecues, card games, birthday dinners. To the neighbors, these were friendly get-togethers. To insiders, they were strategy sessions. Discussions about business were casual, disguised as small talk. Nothing written, nothing direct. Every conversation layered in subtlety. A nod could mean approval, a silence could mean death. There was also a side of Accardo that seemed almost philosophical. He read history, admired disciplined leaders, and studied the psychology of control. He believed that power should never be flaunted because attention was death. "The man who talks too much," he once said to a confidant, "always ends up talking to the wrong person." That wisdom, more than anything, defined his survival. In a world where every other mobster eventually drew fire, either from rivals or the law, Accardo endured. But even in peace, he never relaxed completely. He knew that silence wasn't immunity, it was maintenance. Every day was an act of vigilance. Every smile, every gesture, every word measured to maintain the illusion of normalcy. He was a man who could sit on his porch in the evening, sipping a drink as the sun dipped below the trees, while beneath that serene exterior churned the machinery of an empire. To outsiders, Tony Accardo was the king who had left the castle for a quiet retirement. To those who understood, he was still very much on the throne, ruling from the shadows of suburbia. His suburban camouflage was not just cover, it was the purest expression of his genius. He had built a life so ordinary that it became extraordinary. And so, in River Forest, the Don in a cardigan sat behind drawn curtains, playing the part of a peaceful retiree, while from the depths of his calm domestic world, he continued to pull the strings of Chicago's silent empire. He had achieved what no gangster before him ever had: absolute power without exposure, respect without fear, and control without chaos. The city slept, the neighbors smiled, and Tony Accardo, the kingpin in a cardigan, watched quietly, ensuring that the empire of shadows never slept at all. By the late 1950s, Tony Accardo's empire had reached a level of sophistication few could comprehend. From the outside, it appeared as though he had retired, spending his days in quiet comfort, playing golf, and enjoying family life. But behind that calm facade, he remained the unseen force guiding the outfit's every major decision. He no longer needed to be on the streets, his influence extended through layers of loyal men who carried out his will with near-religious precision. And as federal pressure on organized crime intensified, Accardo faced his greatest challenge yet, not from rivals, but from the system itself. The FBI was closing in, determined to bring down the man who had outsmarted them all. The 1950s and early 1960s saw a shift in the American government's approach to organized crime. Senate committees were formed, headlines screamed about the mafia's existence, and high-profile hearings brought mobsters into the public eye. Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and Sam Giancana became names splashed across newspapers. But one man remained a mystery: Tony "Joe Batters" Accardo. He wasn't flashy, didn't crave attention, and didn't grant interviews. He was the invisible thread tying together the outfit's operations, and that invisibility frustrated investigators more than any weapon ever could. The government wanted to make an example out of him. The FBI believed that if they could convict Accardo, they could unravel Chicago's entire criminal network. But they underestimated him. Accardo had built his empire on patience and paranoia, qualities that made him almost untouchable. He had anticipated every angle of attack. His legal defenses were layered as carefully as his business fronts. Whenever the IRS came sniffing around his finances, accountants produced perfectly balanced books. Every asset was explained, every dollar accounted for. When investigators traced suspicious transactions, they hit a dead end: shell companies, middlemen, and distant relatives with impeccable records. The law could see the smoke but never find the fire. Still, Accardo wasn't complacent. He watched as the FBI intensified its focus on the outfit. Surveillance units followed him from his home to restaurants, agents sat in parked cars outside his golf club, and informants tried to infiltrate his ranks. None succeeded. His people were chosen carefully, loyal to the point of devotion. Many had known him for decades, and their fear of betraying him outweighed any incentive the government could offer. For every informant that appeared, another disappeared, quietly and permanently. Accardo's secret weapon was simplicity. He never left behind a trail. He refused to use telephones for business, avoided written communication, and conducted sensitive discussions face-to-face in secure, private locations. Conversations were brief, to the point, and often cloaked in metaphor. Even his most trusted associates often only knew their part of a larger plan, never the full picture. It was compartmentalization at a level that would make intelligence agencies envious. His philosophy was unwavering: if they can't prove it, it didn't happen. During the Senate's famous Kefauver hearings on organized crime in the early 1950s, America got its first televised glimpse of the mafia's power. Flashy bosses like Frank Costello and others were dragged into the spotlight, sweating under the glare of cameras. But Accardo was nowhere to be found. He had no interest in becoming a public figure. When his name was mentioned, it was always in passing, as a mysterious figure who seemed to guide the outfit from behind the curtain. The senators wanted him on the stand, but there was no legal basis to summon him. His hands were too clean. Behind the scenes, however, Accardo was far from passive. He saw the hearings as a warning, a sign that the age of invisibility was growing more difficult. He began to shift power gradually, delegating more responsibilities to trusted lieutenants. Paul Ricca, still a key figure, provided counsel from behind the scenes, while newer faces like Sam Giancana began handling day-to-day operations. Accardo understood succession better than most mob leaders. He didn't cling to the throne. He knew that real power wasn't about holding it, it was about controlling those who appeared to have it. During this transition, Accardo's public persona remained consistent, a respectable businessman, unbothered by the storm around him. The newspapers occasionally hinted at his influence, but there was never proof. When federal agents questioned him, he smiled politely, shrugged, and denied everything. "I'm just a businessman," he'd say. "I play golf and invest in companies. That's all." And somehow, that was enough. The agents could sense the truth beneath his calm voice, but without evidence, their suspicions meant nothing. The tax cases that had destroyed Capone were tried against Accardo too, but he was too careful. Every investment was legitimate, every purchase reasonable. When the government accused him of underreporting income, his lawyers presented immaculate financial records. His legal team, among the best money could buy, turned every accusation into a dead end. To the public, it seemed like luck. To those who knew him, it was perfection. Accardo had spent decades preparing for these moments, building an empire that could withstand not just rivals, but the full weight of the law. His avoidance of prison became legendary. Other bosses, Luciano, Genovese, Lansky, had all faced trials, deportations, or exile. Accardo never did. The closest he came to real legal trouble was an IRS case in the early 1960s, when federal agents tried to link him to income from illegal gambling. They raided homes, seized documents, and interrogated associates. Still, nothing stuck. The case fell apart. Accardo walked away unscathed, his calm demeanor intact. "They keep looking," he told a friend afterward, "but they'll never find me in their papers." His confidence wasn't arrogance, it was experience. He understood that every empire that fell did so from within, not from without. Law enforcement could try to destroy him, but only betrayal could truly bring him down. And so he kept his circle small, his structure tight, and his trust measured. He built layers of insulation not just against the government, but against human weakness itself. By the mid-1960s, Tony Accardo's legend had taken root. The newspapers began calling him, "the man who never went to prison," a title that both fascinated and frustrated the public. Reporters described him as a ghost, a man who appeared to have lived two lives at once. On one hand, a peaceful retiree in the suburbs. On the other, the most powerful criminal in America. When asked about the stories, he smiled faintly and said, "People make up things to pass the time." It was the perfect response, calm, dismissive, and utterly disarming. To law enforcement, he was a riddle that couldn't be solved. To the outfit, he was proof that discipline and silence were stronger than any gun. His survival had become his power. Every time he escaped prosecution, his legend grew. His men believed he was protected by something beyond luck, perhaps destiny, perhaps divine favor. Accardo himself would never say. In the end, the trials, hearings, and investigations only reinforced the myth. While others were paraded before cameras and headlines, Tony Accardo remained a whisper, a presence felt but never caught. He had done what no gangster before him had accomplished. He had built a criminal empire, faced the full scrutiny of the U.S. government, and walked away untouched. The world of organized crime had changed. The spotlight that once exposed gangsters had become a trap. But Accardo knew better than to step into the light. He understood that survival wasn't about defeating your enemies, it was about never letting them see you at all. And so, in an era when the law hunted men like trophies, Tony Accardo remained the one they could never claim, the don who outsmarted the system, the king who never wore his crown in public, the man who turned silence into power. By the mid-1950s and into the early 1960s, Tony Accardo's empire no longer ended at the edges of Chicago. His reach stretched across states, threading into the neon veins of Las Vegas, a city built on illusion, greed, and opportunity. It was here, amid the shimmer of slot machines and the hum of endless nights, that Accardo extended his quiet dominion westward. To the casual visitor, Las Vegas was a dream, a playground for soldiers returning from war, movie stars seeking thrill, and businessmen chasing luck. But behind the glittering facades of the casinos, there was a darker game being played, one where the dice were loaded long before the first bet was placed. Accardo saw Las Vegas not as a gamble, but as an investment. He understood something most mobsters did not: the city's legality was its greatest disguise. Gambling wasn't hidden there, it was celebrated. That made it the perfect laundering machine for money earned through illegal rackets back home. While New York's 5 families squabbled over territory and headlines, Accardo approached Las Vegas like a banker studying a balance sheet. He knew that with discipline and subtlety, he could turn a desert fantasy into a gold mine. The outfit's move into Vegas had begun under Frank Nitti and Paul Ricca, but it was under Accardo's quiet supervision that it matured into a masterpiece of organization. He didn't build casinos himself, nor did he ever appear in their ownership papers. Instead, he used intermediaries, legitimate investors, silent partners, and layers of shell companies, to funnel money into developments that looked entirely clean. His fingerprints never appeared anywhere near the cash flow. To the authorities, the casinos were simply thriving businesses; to Accardo, they were rivers feeding directly into his empire. He understood that Las Vegas was more than just a city, it was a new kind of frontier. It offered both risk and reinvention. The outfit's influence seeped in slowly, first through smaller clubs and local gamblers, then through unions and contractors responsible for building the hotels themselves. The Teamsters Union became a vital artery in this process. With outfit influence inside the pension funds, loans could be granted to casino developers, loans that would eventually feed back into Chicago's coffers with interest. Accardo didn't need to run the casinos directly, he controlled the money behind them. And in Las Vegas, the man who controlled the money controlled everything. Accardo's approach contrasted sharply with the flamboyant style of other mob figures who became synonymous with Las Vegas, like Bugsy Siegel or later, Sam Giancana. Siegel had tried to build an empire through personality and bravado; Accardo built his through patience and paperwork. He knew that the mob's survival depended not on charisma, but on invisibility. Where others saw casinos as symbols of power, he saw them as tools, vehicles for steady profit and influence. Every dollar skimmed from the counting rooms of Las Vegas was accounted for in Chicago's hidden ledgers. The operation was meticulous. Trusted couriers would fly from Nevada to Illinois, carrying envelopes of unreported cash, money that never saw the light of official records. That skim was the outfit's heartbeat, consistent, untraceable, and vital. The casinos themselves might change names, managers, or ownership, but the flow of money never faltered. Accardo made sure of it. He rarely visited Las Vegas himself. On the few occasions he did, he was discreet, staying in private suites, arriving under aliases, and leaving before anyone noticed. He never gambled publicly, never lingered in the spotlight. His philosophy was the same in Nevada as it was in Chicago: let others wear the crown, but always hold the throne. His lieutenants, including Murray, the Camel, Humphreys and Gus Alex, handled negotiations with casino operators and labor leaders, ensuring that every dollar extracted returned home safely. By the early 1960s, the outfit's control over Las Vegas was so pervasive that it rivaled that of New York's most powerful families. The Stardust, the Riviera, the Tropicana, and other major casinos all had silent connections to Chicago money. Accardo's system was elegant in its simplicity. He didn't need to own anything outright, he just needed everyone to owe him something. But while his expansion westward was a triumph of subtlety, it also attracted unwanted attention. The FBI, increasingly aware of organized crime's reach, began investigating Las Vegas casinos for signs of skimming. Senate committees questioned casino owners and union officials, demanding to know where the money was going. But, as always, Accardo was insulated by layers of plausible deniability. His name never appeared in the testimony. If someone asked who was behind the scenes, the answers were vague: investors, partners, backers. The ghost of Accardo was everywhere, but never visible. He viewed the growing federal pressure as part of the natural cycle of business. To him, every storm was temporary if one stayed still long enough. When the heat became too intense, he simply pulled back, letting others take the spotlight. If an associate was caught or indicted, Accardo never reacted emotionally. He would quietly reassign their duties, replace them with someone equally loyal, and continue operations as if nothing had changed. The machine never stopped running, it merely adjusted its gears. The beauty of Accardo's empire was its self-sufficiency. By the 1960s, he had structured the outfit so that it could operate smoothly even without his direct involvement. Each branch, Chicago, Milwaukee, Kansas City, Las Vegas, knew its role and maintained the discipline he demanded. His leadership style was so deeply ingrained that even when he wasn't present, his rules governed every decision. Violence was still used when necessary, but it was clean, precise, and without spectacle. To the outside world, Las Vegas represented the glamour of the American dream, the place where fortune could change in a single roll of the dice. To Tony Accardo, it represented something else entirely: the proof that crime could evolve with the times. He had taken the lessons of the Prohibition era, the bloodshed, the chaos, the downfall of giants, and transformed them into a system of order and profit that could survive indefinitely. As the outfit's influence solidified, Accardo's wealth grew quietly alongside it. His investments expanded into legitimate businesses: car dealerships, construction firms, restaurants, and real estate. Each provided both a source of income and a layer of protection. If questioned about his fortune, he could point to years of honest work and paperwork to match. His empire, once built on street crime, was now hidden behind corporate facades and legal documentation so airtight that even seasoned prosecutors couldn't penetrate it. By the time the 1960s drew to a close, the Chicago outfit had become one of the most profitable criminal organizations in the world. Its reach extended from Chicago's factories to Nevada's casinos, from labor unions to Hollywood studios. Yet through it all, Tony Accardo remained the same: calm, unseen, and unshakably composed. The newspapers called other mobsters bosses, but Accardo was something different, an institution unto himself. He had turned the outlaw's craft into an art of invisibility. No headlines, no handcuffs, no graves. Just silence, precision, and endless profit. Las Vegas had been a gamble for many, but for Tony Accardo, it was just another quiet calculation that paid off perfectly. By the late 1960s, Tony Accardo had achieved something few men in his world ever could: he had become invisible at the height of his power. The Chicago outfit, which once spilled blood across the city's streets, now operated like a quiet multinational corporation. The empire was vast, spanning gambling, labor unions, construction, and Las Vegas casinos. Money poured in from every direction, and every dollar that passed through the system seemed to whisper his name, even if no one dared say it aloud. Yet, as the years passed, Accardo began to retreat from the forefront of daily operations. He wasn't stepping down, he was stepping back, assuming the role of the shadow behind the throne, the power behind every decision, every order, every life and death that rippled through Chicago's underworld. The man who took the stage during this transitional period was Sam Giancana, a charismatic, unpredictable figure who represented a new generation of gangsters. Giancana was everything Accardo was not: flashy, outspoken, and enamored with the spotlight. He courted singers, dined with politicians, and was rumored to have connections with celebrities and even intelligence agencies. To the public, Giancana was the face of the Chicago outfit. But to those inside the organization, it was clear that the quiet man in River Forest still pulled the strings. Accardo's decision to elevate Giancana was both strategic and self-protective. He had no interest in becoming a public target, especially as law enforcement tightened its grip on organized crime in the 1960s. The FBI's new surveillance tactics, wiretaps, undercover agents, long-term investigations, had made the underworld more dangerous than ever. Accardo understood that the outfit needed a visible leader, a lightning rod to absorb attention while he remained untouchable in the background. Giancana, with his ego and appetite for fame, was perfect for that role. From his quiet home in River Forest, Accardo observed everything. He didn't micromanage, but he listened. His trusted lieutenants, Murray Humphreys, Gus Alex, and Jack Cerrone, kept him informed about every shift in power, every dispute, every risk. Giancana might have been the front man, but Accardo was the board chairman. He made the final calls, issued quiet approvals, and occasionally, silent warnings. When Giancana made decisions that threatened the outfit's stability, Accardo intervened, not with confrontation, but with consequence. The contrast between the two men couldn't have been greater. Giancana craved attention, Accardo despised it. Giancana surrounded himself with entertainers, flaunted wealth, and gave interviews to journalists hungry for mafia gossip. Accardo played golf, attended church, and blended into suburban tranquility. Giancana saw himself as a star in America's crime story, Accardo saw himself as the author, writing it quietly from the margins. Their relationship was one of calculated tolerance. Giancana provided the flash, Accardo ensured the survival. Under Giancana's leadership, the outfit expanded into new territories: international gambling, narcotics, and covert political operations. Rumors swirled of ties between the mob and the CIA during the Cold War, whispers that mob figures had been involved in attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro. Whether or not these stories were true, they reflected the world's growing fascination with the intersection between crime, politics, and power. But to Accardo, these entanglements were dangerous. He believed the outfit's strength lay in stability, not spectacle. When Giancana's ego began to threaten that balance, Accardo grew quietly discontent. He watched as the FBI intensified its scrutiny. Agents bugged phones, tapped meetings, and placed microphones in bars and restaurants frequented by mobsters. The era of whispers was fading, everything was being recorded. Accardo saw the writing on the wall: Giancana's high-profile lifestyle was attracting too much heat. The organization's carefully cultivated invisibility was eroding under the weight of Giancana's fame. By the mid-1960s, tensions between the two men were quietly escalating. Accardo, though retired in appearance, still commanded the respect of every serious figure in the outfit. When he disapproved of Giancana's actions, his displeasure spread through the ranks like a cold wind. Associates began choosing sides cautiously. To defy Giancana might be dangerous, but to defy Accardo was unthinkable. When Giancana's conflicts with the FBI reached a breaking point and his arrogance began to endanger profits, Accardo made a move. In 1966, the outfit removed Giancana from power, forcing him into exile in Mexico. The message was clear: the organization was bigger than any one man. Even the most charismatic leader was disposable if he forgot that rule. Accardo didn't need to announce the change. There were no gunfights, no public betrayals, just a smooth, silent transition. New leaders emerged, such as Felix, Milwaukee Phil, Alderiggio and Jack Cerrone, both loyal to Accardo's methods of discipline and discretion. Under their watch, the outfit returned to its roots, quiet efficiency. The machine had corrected itself, and the architect had ensured its survival once again. For all his ruthlessness, Accardo's approach to leadership remained almost Zen-like. He viewed chaos as a failure of structure. His control was psychological, built on respect, fear, and the unspoken awareness that he was always watching. Even in retirement, men still visited his home for guidance, asking for advice, permission, or forgiveness. He'd listen calmly, speak softly, and make decisions with a level of detachment that made his authority absolute. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. His eyes, steady and unflinching, were enough. Those who sat with him described the experience as chilling. He could listen to a man explain a problem for an hour and then solve it in a single sentence. If you were honest, he might help you. If you lied, he'd know before you finished speaking. And if you betrayed him, you'd simply vanish from the story. The FBI, watching from the sidelines, grew increasingly frustrated. They could see the pattern. Every major decision in the outfit still bore Accardo's influence, but they couldn't catch him doing anything illegal. The man they called Big Tuna seemed to have retired completely, yet everything he touched still moved according to his will. His retirement was, in truth, an illusion, a carefully crafted shield that kept him beyond the reach of the law. The younger men in the outfit revered him as a living legend. They called him the man who knew how to live. To them, he was the perfect example of what a mob boss should be: intelligent, calm, untouchable. He had survived the Prohibition Wars, outlasted Capone's empire, and sidestepped every government trap. He didn't rule through violence, he ruled through time. As the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, Accardo's name faded from newspapers, but his influence deepened. The outfit remained powerful, wealthy, and remarkably stable, a testament to the system he had built. From his quiet home, the retired Don continued to shape the underworld like a shadow shapes the light. He had become something rare in the history of organized crime, a man who understood that real power doesn't shout or demand to be seen. It simply exists, unchallenged, like gravity. And as younger, brasher men took the stage, Tony Accardo sat in silence, the ghost in the machine, ensuring that the empire he built would endure long after the applause faded. By the dawn of the 1970s, the Chicago outfit was in a state of transition once again. The world was changing, law enforcement was more organized, surveillance technology more advanced, and the public less tolerant of corruption. The glamorous chaos of the mafia's golden years had faded into the rearview mirror. Yet, in a modest home in River Forest, one man still held absolute sway over it all. Tony Accardo was now an elder statesman of crime, the invisible monarch of an empire that stretched from Chicago to Las Vegas. But even as he grew older, his mind remained sharp, his instincts razor-edged, and his control as absolute as ever. Still, the legacy of his chosen successor, Sam Giancana, lingered like a bad taste. Giancana's flamboyant reign had left scars on the outfit's reputation and unwanted heat from law enforcement. The FBI had intensified its war against organized crime during the 1960s, fueled by new tools like wiretaps, undercover agents, and the RICO Act in the early 1970s. The outfit's once invisible empire was suddenly under a microscope. Accardo knew that if he didn't act decisively, everything he had built could crumble. Giancana's years in exile had done little to cool his ego. From Mexico, he continued to make calls, boast to associates, and speak too freely about past connections, some even rumored to involve intelligence agencies and political figures. When he finally returned to the United States in 1974, after years abroad, he expected to reclaim his place at the top. But Accardo had other plans. The Chicago outfit had no room for chaos, and Giancana had become a liability. His relationships with celebrities, his loud mouth, and his arrogance were the opposite of everything Accardo stood for. Quietly, Accardo made it clear to the outfit's hierarchy that the old ways must prevail: discipline, secrecy, and silence. The era of showmanship was over. Those who had admired Giancana's flamboyance began to distance themselves. Accardo didn't need to issue direct orders, his intent was understood instinctively. In 1975, Giancana was found dead in the basement of his Oak Park home, shot multiple times in the head and neck while cooking dinner. The message was unmistakable: betrayal and disobedience would never be tolerated, even from those who had once stood closest to the throne. The news sent shockwaves through Chicago's underworld. Law enforcement suspected the outfit immediately, but no one ever spoke, and no one was ever charged. Inside the organization, the murder restored an old truth: the outfit belonged to Tony Accardo, and to Tony Accardo alone. After Giancana's death, Accardo quietly restructured the organization again. He appointed new leadership, men like Joseph, Joey Doves, Iappa and Anthony, Joe Batters Jr. Spilatro took prominent roles, each representing a different aspect of the outfit's reach. Iappa was cautious and loyal, a traditionalist molded in Accardo's image. Spilatro, however, was younger, more ambitious, and eventually became the outfit's man in Las Vegas, overseeing the casinos and enforcing control in the desert. Accardo watched both men carefully, recognizing in Spilatro the dangerous spark of recklessness that could one day ignite trouble. Still, for a time, things worked. The outfit's profits remained strong, fed by its control of gambling, labor unions, and loan-sharking operations. The Las Vegas scam, the secret siphoning of casino profits before they reached the books, continued to funnel millions into Chicago each year. Accardo's system of insulation was working flawlessly. He never appeared in a courtroom, never handled illicit money himself, and never allowed his name to surface in official records. Even the FBI agents assigned to him began to speak of him with a kind of grudging admiration. "He's too smart," one agent reportedly said. "He's the last man left who still runs this like a business." But Accardo's world was also beginning to feel the tremors of a changing America. New laws, new prosecutors, and an increasingly bold media meant that organized crime could no longer hide in the same shadows it once did. Younger mobsters didn't have the patience or discipline that he demanded. They wanted fast money, flashy lifestyles, and instant gratification. Accardo saw in them the same arrogance that had doomed Capone and Giancana. It troubled him deeply. He began to withdraw further from public life, but not from power. He held meetings in private homes rather than restaurants. He rarely traveled, preferring to let his captains come to him. His word remained final, even when it came through intermediaries. If Accardo approved an operation, it went forward. If he didn't, it died in the planning stage. His silence carried more authority than another man's speech. The death of Giancana marked the end of an era, not just for the outfit, but for organized crime itself. The flamboyant, headline-grabbing mobster was a relic of the past. The new model was the one Accardo had perfected decades earlier: invisible, efficient, unflinching. To the men who followed, Giancana's downfall was both a warning and a prophecy. The outfit could not afford vanity, it required obedience. Yet, as Accardo aged, the pressures of maintaining invisibility in a modernizing world grew heavier. Wiretaps captured whispers about him, coded references that investigators began piecing together. Federal prosecutors launched the Operation Strawman investigation into Las Vegas casino skimming, eventually exposing major figures connected to Chicago's outfit. While Accardo's name never appeared in indictments, it hovered in the background like a ghostly presence, the architect behind the architects. Inside the outfit, his influence remained sacred. Younger bosses would lower their voices when they mentioned him, referring to him as the old man or simply Joe Batters. He had become mythological, a living legend who ruled through patience and reputation rather than fear. Even when he gave orders through others, men followed as if he had spoken directly. When Giancana's flashy era faded into blood and silence, the outfit entered what many called the Accardo Restoration. Violence decreased, profits stabilized, and the organization returned to its disciplined roots. Accardo had once again done what no one else could. He had steered the outfit through chaos without ever stepping into the light himself. Law enforcement knew it too. They would sometimes park outside his river forest mansion, watching his car come and go, hoping for a mistake. But Tony never slipped. He was always polite if questioned, calm when photographed, and unbothered by the rumors swirling around him. To reporters who asked about the mob, he'd give the same answer he'd given for years: "I'm just an honest businessman. People talk too much." In truth, he had built his legacy not on brutality, but on brilliance. His power didn't come from killing, it came from understanding human nature. He knew when to forgive, when to punish, and when to disappear from view. Every rival who underestimated him ended up gone. Every investigator who pursued him came up empty-handed. He was, by all accounts, the last of his kind, the last boss who understood that control wasn't about fear or fame. It was about endurance. And as Chicago changed around him, as the old neighborhoods gave way to highways and high-rises, Tony Accardo remained unchanged. The man who had once enforced Capone's orders now ruled a new era, still unseen, still undefeated. In the end, Sam Giancana's downfall wasn't just a story of betrayal or power, it was a story of contrast. One man burned out in the light. The other lived forever in the dark. And in that darkness, Tony Accardo continued to build his quiet immortality. The 1970s rolled over Chicago with the hum of change, skyscrapers rising where old neighborhoods once stood, the city's politics tightening under new federal scrutiny, and the underworld learning to adapt or die. For Tony Accardo, now in his late 60s, the transformation of his empire was both inevitable and personal. He had seen empires rise in blood and crumble in arrogance. He had survived wars, investigations, betrayals, and revolutions within his own organization. Now, as he stood at the twilight of his reign, his task was to preserve what he had built, to restore the discipline, the silence, and the balance that had made the outfit an invisible kingdom for half a century. The chaos left behind by Sam Giancana's fall had shaken the foundations of the Chicago outfit. The flamboyance of the 1960s was gone, but so too was the simplicity of earlier years. Federal agents were smarter, wiretaps sharper, and the press relentless. The old codes of loyalty were weakening under the weight of greed and paranoia. Yet, through it all, Accardo remained a constant, a still figure in a world of motion. His patience was his armor, and his reputation alone kept the entire organization aligned. Men might question other bosses, but not him. After Giancana's death, the outfit entered a period of quiet reformation that historians later referred to as the Accardo Restoration. He appointed Joseph "Joey Doves" Iuppa as the front boss, a man who understood both the old ways and the modern landscape. Iuppa was cautious, obedient, and loyal to the bone, qualities that Accardo valued above all else. Together, they stabilized the outfit, tightening control over gambling, loan sharking, and union rackets while minimizing exposure. The violence that had once drawn attention was now replaced by quiet efficiency. Behind the scenes, Accardo orchestrated every move like a conductor. He met with Iuppa and underboss Jack Cerrone in private homes or discreet restaurants. Conversations were calm, brief, and deliberate. Accardo would listen, nod, and in a few measured words, deliver instructions that shaped the destiny of the outfit. He didn't need to give orders in writing or through intermediaries, his presence was enough to ensure compliance. To disobey him, even decades after his so-called retirement, was unthinkable. But beneath the calm surface, danger was stirring. Law enforcement had begun focusing heavily on Las Vegas, where the outfit's skimming operations, money siphoned directly from casino cash rooms, had become one of the mob's most profitable ventures. Millions were being funneled back to Chicago every year, unreported and untaxed. The FBI, determined to shut down the mob's influence in Nevada, launched massive investigations that would eventually expose connections between Chicago, Kansas City, and Milwaukee crime families. The outfit's quiet hold on the desert was beginning to crack under federal light. Accardo saw it coming before anyone else. He had always believed that longevity in crime depended on knowing when to step forward and when to vanish. As the heat intensified, he ordered a partial pullback, fewer visits to Vegas, fewer phone calls, fewer risks. He reminded his men of the golden rule: stay invisible. But not everyone listened. Younger associates, especially those stationed in Las Vegas, grew greedy and careless. Anthony Spilatro, the outfit's man in the desert, became too visible, his violence and high-profile lifestyle drawing media attention and FBI surveillance. Accardo's frustration was silent but palpable. He had spent decades teaching discipline, yet here was another generation repeating the same mistakes that had doomed their predecessors. In private conversations, he lamented the changing times. "They want everything too fast," he once told a confidant. "Fast money, fast cars, fast death." To him, the new breed of mobsters lacked the patience that had made him immortal. When the FBI's Strawman investigation began closing in during the late 1970s, exposing casino skimming operations and leading to dozens of indictments, Accardo's instincts once again proved right. Though many outfit figures were caught in the dragnet, his name remained untouched. He had kept his distance, left no trail, and ensured that those who worked under him could not implicate him even if they wanted to. The old fox had outwitted the hunters yet again. But his patience wasn't infinite. When greed crossed the line into disrespect, Accardo reminded everyone that his quiet nature was not weakness, it was restraint. The most chilling example of this came in 1978, in what became one of the most infamous episodes of his later years, the burglary incident. While Accardo and his family were away on vacation, burglars broke into his River Forest mansion. They ransacked the home, stole jewelry, and violated the sanctuary that he had maintained for decades. To most, it might have been a simple robbery. But to Tony Accardo, it was an unforgivable insult. His home represented his peace, his privacy, the one place untouched by the chaos of his world. The violation was personal. Within weeks, the burglars began turning up dead, brutally murdered, their bodies found in alleys, trunks, and basements. Law enforcement quickly connected the killings to Accardo, but there was no evidence, no witnesses, and no confessions. The message was unmistakable: even in his old age, Tony Accardo's reach was absolute. His rules still applied, and his vengeance was as quiet as it was final. The episode solidified his legend among both allies and enemies. To the FBI, it was proof that the old man still ruled. To the outfit, it was a reminder that disrespect carried the same price it always had. Accardo never spoke publicly about the break-in, but those close to him said he took it as a personal test, a moment where he reminded the world that even in his twilight years, no one violated Tony Accardo and lived to tell the story. Despite these flashes of wrath, his day-to-day life remained deceptively peaceful. He spent his mornings reading newspapers, his afternoons golfing, and his evenings dining quietly with family. Friends described him as polite, charming even. He never spoke of business in public. His ability to compartmentalize, to separate the ruthless logic of his empire from the calm routine of his personal life, was part of what made him so effective. In the latter half of the 1970s, the Chicago outfit continued to thrive, even as law enforcement pressure intensified nationwide. Accardo's legacy of structure and discipline protected it from implosion. The FBI called him the Last Don, a man whose influence extended through generations of criminals, even as his name faded from headlines. He had achieved what no one before him had: stability through silence. By the decade's end, Tony Accardo had proven once more that he could adapt, survive, and outlast everyone who challenged him. He was older now, slower in step, but his mind was still sharp. The world around him was modernizing, yet his ancient code, control through calm, power through patience, remained timeless. And so, as Chicago entered the 1980s with flashing lights and wiretaps humming through the air, Tony Accardo, the man who had lived his entire life in the shadows, remained untouched. His enemies were dead, his empire intact, and his name still unblemished by conviction. He was the living embodiment of his own philosophy: power that shouts is temporary. Power that whispers never dies. The winter of 1978 fell cold over Chicago, and the quiet streets of River Forest glistened beneath a thin sheet of snow. Inside his grand but modestly furnished home, Tony Accardo sat before a fireplace, reading the evening paper as he had done for decades. His life seemed peaceful, routine, almost mundane to those who did not know better. But that peace was about to be broken in a way that would shake even a man as composed as he was. The event would become one of the most chilling and revealing chapters in his long and shadowed story: the break-in at the Don's house, and the blood-soaked lesson that followed. It began with arrogance, as many tragedies in the underworld do. A small group of burglars, young and reckless, decided to target what they believed was just another wealthy Chicago household. They had no idea whose home they were entering. Accardo's mansion, elegant but understated, had always stood quietly among its neighbors, large enough to impress, but never ostentatious. The thieves likely thought it belonged to a businessman or perhaps an executive with valuables worth stealing. They couldn't have known that they were breaking into the residence of one of the most feared and respected men in organized crime. While Accardo and his family were away on vacation, the burglars broke in through a side entrance. They ransacked the home, stealing jewelry, cash, and other valuables, rumored to be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. To the burglars, it was just another job. To Tony Accardo, it was something far deeper. When he returned and found his private sanctuary violated, something cold shifted within him. The house had always been sacred to him, a symbol of the peace he had earned after decades of surviving wars, betrayals, and investigations. It was the one place where he had allowed himself to feel human. The burglary wasn't just theft, it was an act of disrespect, an intrusion into the carefully walled fortress of his life. Accardo's calm exterior never cracked publicly. He didn't shout. He didn't call the police. He didn't even complain. He simply nodded, spoke softly to a few of his trusted lieutenants, and resumed his routine as though nothing had happened. But beneath that calm surface, he had already made a decision. For Accardo, punishment wasn't about revenge, it was about restoring order. What followed would become one of the most infamous and terrifying examples of mafia retribution in American history. Over the next several months, the burglars, one by one, began to vanish or turn up dead. Some were found shot multiple times, others beaten or strangled. Their bodies appeared in alleys, cars, and dumpsters across the city. Each killing carried the same quiet efficiency that had defined Accardo's leadership. There were no witnesses, no patterns, and no arrests. The message was unmistakable: the Don might have retired, but his power was eternal. Law enforcement immediately suspected Accardo's involvement, but as always, there was no evidence. The FBI, well aware of his long history of precision, knew that he didn't order violence lightly. Every act served a purpose. The killings, they reasoned, weren't out of anger, they were an assertion of principle. The old rules of respect, loyalty, and silence still governed the outfit, and anyone who broke them, intentionally or not, would pay the ultimate price. The newspapers called it the Revenge of Joe Batters. To the public, it sounded like a ghost story from Chicago's past, an echo of the city's gangster glory days. But to those in the underworld, it was a very real reminder that Tony Accardo was still watching. Even in his old age, even while living quietly among ordinary families, he was capable of unleashing absolute and terrifying authority. The outfit was not a democracy. It was his creation. His law still ruled. After the incident, a subtle but noticeable change rippled through Chicago's underworld. Men who had begun to think of Accardo as an old relic, a harmless retiree, were reminded that he was neither. His silence had always been mistaken for weakness by the unwise. Now, no one dared to make that mistake again. The killings reaffirmed his command in a single stroke. Without a word, Accardo had reminded the city, and his own organization, that the empire he built could not be trespassed upon, not by rivals, not by fools, not by fate. Behind closed doors, those close to him described the period as one of quiet intensity. Accardo was not outwardly angry, he was reflective. He spent more time at home, surrounded by family, reading, or tending to his garden. Yet, even in these simple routines, there was a stillness that carried weight. Those who came to visit, capos, lieutenants, and longtime associates, did so with reverence. He spoke little about the incident, never mentioned the burglars, and gave no public statement. The silence, as always, was louder than any declaration. The FBI increased its surveillance after the murders, but their efforts once again proved fruitless. They monitored his calls, followed his car, even placed informants within the outfit's ranks. Yet, every lead dissolved into air. Accardo's system was too insulated, too disciplined. There were no loose ends. Every man involved in the retaliation was hand-picked, loyal, and utterly silent. To betray Accardo meant erasure from existence, no second chances, no negotiations. In a private conversation years later, one law enforcement officer summed it up perfectly: it wasn't just revenge, it was art. Accardo didn't need chaos to prove a point. He made order out of fear. After the blood cooled and the city's attention drifted elsewhere, Accardo's life returned to its tranquil rhythm. But the incident left a mark, not on him, but on everyone around him. It became legend within the outfit, a cautionary tale passed down through generations: never disrespect the old man. Not his word. Not his name. Not his peace. The episode also revealed something deeper about Accardo's philosophy of power. It wasn't about domination or cruelty, it was about control. To him, authority wasn't a performance, it was a presence. He didn't need to be seen to be felt. The burglars' deaths weren't an outburst of violence but a restoration of balance, an act that reaffirmed the natural order he had spent a lifetime creating. As the 1980s approached, the city around him began to modernize, but Tony Accardo remained timeless, unchanged, unbroken, untouched. Younger mobsters rose and fell, investigators retired, and entire branches of the outfit shifted, but the man in River Forest remained where he had always been, at the quiet center of it all. Those who knew him said that after the burglary, something in him settled permanently. He had proven his point for the last time. There was no need for further demonstrations. His empire, his name, and his legend were secure. The world would continue to change, but Tony Accardo's rule, silent, absolute, and eternal, would remain the gold standard of organized power. And so, the story of the burglary became more than a tale of vengeance, it became the perfect metaphor for the man himself. He could be calm for years, serene as a still lake. But if disturbed, that stillness could become an abyss. He had lived by a simple truth all his life: respect is not demanded. It is enforced. And in that cold Chicago winter, he enforced it one final time, with the quiet precision of a man who had never missed a step in his long and dangerous dance with power. By the early 1980s, Tony Accardo had become a living legend, not just within Chicago's underworld, but among law enforcement, journalists, and anyone who had studied the long, bloody history of organized crime. He was in his mid-70s now, an age most mobsters never lived to see. Yet here he was, still alive, still sharp, still free. His contemporaries were either dead, imprisoned, or forgotten. The names that once dominated headlines, Capone, Giancana, Nitti, Ricca, were ghosts. But Tony Accardo remained. He was the last link to a bygone era, the elder Don who had ruled for half a century without ever wearing a crown, without ever stepping into the limelight. And though the fires of ambition had cooled, his influence burned steady and strong, warming the empire he had built from the shadows. To outsiders, he appeared to have finally retired. His River Forest home was quieter than ever. His days followed a predictable rhythm, mornings with the newspaper and coffee, afternoons spent golfing or visiting with family, and evenings at home with his wife, Clarice, often watching television in silence. He dressed neatly but simply, a man with nothing left to prove. To neighbors, he was the image of dignity, polite, composed, and harmless. They saw him as an old Italian gentleman enjoying the rewards of a long life of hard work. But those who understood the truth knew better. Accardo hadn't retired, he had transcended. Even in his old age, he remained the outfit's invisible compass. His advice guided every major decision, his approval carried the weight of law. The bosses who followed him, Joey Iuppa, Jack Cerrone, and others, all deferred to his judgment. When disputes arose, they went to him quietly, seeking wisdom or absolution. Accardo's opinion wasn't requested, it was required. Men decades younger still addressed him with the same deference they had shown in his prime. His authority was so absolute that it no longer needed enforcement. He was the embodiment of the code itself. Behind closed doors, he still ran meetings from the comfort of his living room. Younger mobsters would arrive respectfully, usually on Sunday afternoons. They would sit at his kitchen table, lower their voices, and wait for him to speak. He would ask brief, pointed questions. Is the business clean? Are the books straight? Are they quiet out there? And then listen. When he gave an instruction, it was simple, precise, and final. He never wasted words. His calm tone carried more weight than threats or shouts ever could. One quiet nod from him could change the course of the outfit's direction for months. The Chicago outfit of the 1980s had become a shadow of what it once was, but under Accardo's distant supervision, it remained stable and profitable. While the FBI cracked down on crime families in New York with the RICO Act, Chicago's syndicate avoided the same scale of devastation. The reason was clear: Accardo's long-standing system of insulation still worked. Orders flowed downward through carefully managed layers. No one man knew too much, and every operation had distance between leadership and execution. This structure, built over decades, was so effective that even the FBI grudgingly referred to it as the Accardo model. Law enforcement continued to try to catch him. The FBI planted bugs in bars and social clubs, hoping to hear whispers of his name. They watched his home, followed his visitors, and even tried to plant microphones near his driveway. Yet, as always, Tony gave them nothing. He lived his life like a chess master, every move measured, every silence intentional. There were no mistakes, no stray comments, no loose ends. He had learned long ago that the most powerful thing a man could say in his position was nothing at all. Even as the outfit's younger men became more reckless, Accardo's code endured among the old guard. He insisted on 3 unbreakable rules: no unnecessary violence, no publicity, and no betrayal. If you stay small, you stay safe, he would often say to his protégés. To him, the greatest danger wasn't law enforcement, it was ego. He'd seen too many kings destroyed by their own need to be seen. For Accardo, invisibility was still the greatest power a man could possess. Yet, even as he remained untouchable, the world around him was changing faster than ever. Technology, wiretaps, banking systems, all made the shadows smaller. The Chicago outfit was no longer the sprawling empire it had once been, but Accardo's steady hand kept it alive. He had turned it from a force of chaos into a quiet institution, part business, part tradition, part ghost. And though he no longer involved himself in the day-to-day operations, every dollar that changed hands in Chicago's underground carried a trace of his discipline. His life at home reflected that same order. The house was peaceful, filled with family photos, religious icons, and the quiet hum of routine. His wife Clarice, loyal and graceful, remained his anchor. Their children and grandchildren often visited, filling the once quiet mansion with laughter. Those who saw him during these family gatherings said he was gentle, even tender, a far cry from the ruthless Don whispered about in FBI files. To his grandchildren, he was simply Papa, the man who told stories and slipped them candy when their parents weren't looking. He never spoke of his past, never mentioned the outfit. The worlds he lived in were completely separate, one of power and one of peace, and he moved between them effortlessly. Despite his serene domestic life, Accardo never let his guard down entirely. He still read reports from his trusted lieutenants, still followed the headlines closely, and still noticed when someone stepped out of line. His discipline remained unshakable. Even at 75, his mind was sharper than most men half his age. He remembered names, dates, and details with uncanny precision. And though he rarely issued orders directly anymore, his presence was enough to keep the outfit in check. The men under him lived with a constant awareness. Tony Accardo was watching. By now, even law enforcement officers who had spent their careers chasing him began to respect him in a strange way. They called him the genius, the machine, the untouchable. Some admitted privately that they admired his intellect, his control, and his longevity. Unlike so many gangsters, Accardo never allowed greed or rage to cloud his judgment. He had mastered the art of survival. He wasn't just lucky, he was deliberate. Every decision, every relationship, every withdrawal from the spotlight was calculated. As the 1980s moved forward, the Chicago outfit began to shrink under federal pressure. Indictments swept through the ranks, and many of Accardo's protégés faced prison time. But even as the FBI took victory laps in the press, they knew one man remained beyond their reach. Accardo was untouchable, not because of legal trickery, but because of discipline. He had lived every day of his life by the same rule: leave nothing that can be used against you. In his final years, Tony Accardo became almost mythical. Younger mobsters who had never even met him spoke of him with reverence, as though he were more idea than man, the embodiment of what a true Don should be: quiet, calculating, and undefeated. To them, he was not just history, he was the blueprint. In photographs from this time, Accardo's expression never changed. His face, still strong despite age, carried a faint, knowing smile, the kind of smile that belonged to someone who had seen everything and survived it all. The world around him had changed beyond recognition, but he hadn't. He remained constant, a silent force moving beneath the surface of modern America. He once said, in one of his rare private reflections, "If you live right, you don't need luck. You just need time." And time, it seemed, was the only thing Tony Accardo ever truly took from anyone. He had lived through wars, crackdowns, betrayals, and revolutions in crime, yet he remained untouched. No prison bars, no courtroom convictions, no public disgrace. Just a man in a cardigan, sitting quietly in his suburban home, reading the paper while empires moved to his rhythm. In his twilight, Tony Accardo wasn't just a survivor. He was a legend made flesh, the living embodiment of control, patience, and silence. And as the world outside grew louder, he remained perfectly still, the elder Don who had mastered the only kind of power that lasts forever, the kind that never needs to be spoken. By the early 1980s, Tony Accardo was entering the last great chapter of his life, not as a fugitive or a fading relic, but as something rarer, a man who had mastered time itself. He was now in his late 70s, white-haired, slower in movement, but every inch still the Don. For decades, he had ruled the Chicago outfit without shouting, without grandstanding, and most remarkably, without prison bars ever closing behind him. Now, as age crept in, even the FBI seemed to sense that their most elusive adversary was nearing his twilight. Yet, even in his old age, Accardo remained untouchable, a quiet force who commanded respect simply by existing. Agents called him the Phantom of River Forest. They had watched him for years, parked cars on his street, recorded conversations, and filled endless reports. But every operation ended the same way: no evidence, no witnesses, no weakness. He was always careful, always calm. The younger agents found it hard to believe that the soft-spoken old man who waved politely from his driveway was the same Tony Accardo whose empire once stretched from Chicago's back alleys to Las Vegas casinos. To the veterans who had chased him for decades, however, there was no doubt, he was still in control, still the quiet center of a vast machine. The outfit had changed under his long shadow. It was smaller now, more discreet, its violent edges smoothed into businesslike efficiency. Men like Joey Iuppa and Jack Cerrone handled daily operations, but they always deferred to the old man. They visited his home, updated him on problems, and sought his silent approval. A nod from Accardo was worth more than a signed order. Even in semi-retirement, his influence reached every corner of the organization. To defy him was unthinkable, to disappoint him, unforgivable. Law enforcement, for their part, never stopped watching. The FBI planted bugs, tailed cars, and intercepted conversations, hoping for a single slip. Yet Accardo never left fingerprints, not on paper, not on tape, not in words. When questioned, he was polite and unflappable, always claiming to be a businessman enjoying his later years. He spoke in clipped, measured sentences that gave nothing away. Agents often left interviews frustrated, convinced they had faced something closer to a chess master than a criminal. As the Reagan era unfolded, America's mob scene was collapsing elsewhere. The RICO Act had crippled New York's 5 families, and high-profile figures like John Gotti were attracting destructive attention. But in Chicago, things remained stable. That was Accardo's legacy, his blueprint of discipline. While others sought fame, he had built a structure meant to last. The outfit's motto, still repeated quietly among its men, echoed his philosophy: stay small, stay smart, stay silent. He still made public appearances from time to time, dining at Italian restaurants or attending family gatherings, always calm, always impeccably dressed. Younger mobsters treated him with awe, lowering their voices in his presence. To them, he was living history, the man who had walked beside Capone and outlived everyone who had dared to stand in his path. Some even believed he was blessed, untouchable by fate itself. But Accardo's power was not mysticism, it was discipline. He had outlasted his enemies by mastering restraint. He knew when to speak and when to disappear, when to act and when to wait. The world had changed, the city was cleaner, the press bolder, and technology more invasive, yet no one could find a single misstep in his record. His control was total because it began within himself. One retired FBI agent once said, almost admiringly, "Accardo doesn't break laws, he bends the world around them." That was the secret, he understood people, not just systems. He knew that loyalty wasn't bought with money but with order. His men followed him because life under him was predictable, profitable, and safe, the 3 things most criminals could never find. By the late 1980s, Tony Accardo had achieved what every mobster claimed to want but none could reach: peace. The empire still functioned, the money still flowed, and yet he lived like a retired patriarch. Every morning he would walk slowly to his mailbox, wave at his neighbors, and read the paper as if he had never touched a day of crime in his life. But beneath that quiet routine lay a truth everyone in Chicago understood: Tony Accardo had never stepped down. He had simply ascended beyond reach. In a world where every gangster either died young or died in chains, he alone had found another path: silence, patience, and endurance. He didn't need headlines. He didn't need fear. His existence itself was proof that true power isn't loud, it's lasting. By the late 1980s, Tony Accardo had become more myth than man. At over 80, he ruled quietly from his river forest home, watching the city he once commanded move on without truly escaping his shadow. His daily life was simple: breakfast, newspapers, family visits, yet every man in the outfit still followed his unspoken law. He no longer needed to attend meetings, his lessons had become scripture. Even as his body weakened, his influence never faded. The FBI still watched, frustrated that decades of surveillance yielded nothing. Accardo remained untouchable, polite, careful, and always a step beyond their reach. To younger mobsters, he was an immortal figure, the silent architect of a criminal empire that had outlasted time itself. In his final years, he lived surrounded by family and peace, a man who had seen every rival fall while he endured. The world changed, but his philosophy didn't: stay quiet, stay disciplined, stay unseen. Tony Accardo's era was ending, but his silence still ruled Chicago's underworld, proof that true power doesn't need noise to last forever. In his final years, Tony Accardo lived in near-total quiet. The once feared Don of Chicago's underworld had grown old, his empire running smoothly without his hand. At 86, his mind remained sharp, but his body had slowed. Each morning he read the newspaper by the window, sipped his coffee, and watched the light shift over the same river forest streets he had ruled from the shadows for decades. To his family, he was just Papa Tony, calm, reserved, rarely speaking of the past. To those who knew his true legacy, he was the last ghost of a vanished world. He reflected often, friends said, not with regret but with detachment. "I did what I had to do," he would murmur when asked about his life. His empire had outlasted its rivals, his rules had become law, and no cell had ever closed behind him. When illness came, he met it with the same discipline that had defined his life. On May 22, 1992, Tony Accardo died quietly in his sleep, no headlines, no handcuffs, no final act of defiance. Just silence. He was buried in Hillside, Illinois, among the men who had built and bled for his empire. But unlike them, he left no chaos behind. His death marked the end of an era, the last breath of old Chicago's code: loyalty, discipline, invisibility. Even the FBI, his lifelong pursuers, admitted a grudging respect. Tony Accardo had done what no gangster ever had before: he had won by surviving. In the years after Tony Accardo's death, his name faded from headlines but never from history. He had become a legend, a ghost that haunted the story of organized crime. To the Chicago outfit, he was still the man, the model of discipline and endurance. To law enforcement, he was the one that got away, a reminder that intelligence could outmatch brute force. Accardo's real legacy wasn't money or territory, it was the system he built. His structure of order, patience, and invisibility shaped the outfit for decades after his passing. He had proven that silence could be a fortress, and that real power didn't need to be seen to be felt. His name was rarely spoken aloud, but it lingered like a quiet rule no one dared break. Today, historians describe him as the perfect paradox, a criminal who lived like a monk of control. He died free, undefeated, and unrepentant, leaving behind a truth few ever learn: that the loudest men burn quickly, and the quiet ones last forever. Tony Accardo's empire faded with time, but his lesson remains carved in shadow: true power never shouts, it simply endures.